So hello and a warm welcome to you all. During this webinar, we will be focusing on the rapidly changing regulations for recycling of e-waste, packaging and batteries in the USA and Canada, and also how European regulations apply to North American companies. My name is Lisa Dean and I'm the Head of Global Compliance at Sphera EC4P. I've been providing expert consulting to manufacturers on a global e-waste, batteries and packaging compliance for the last 10 years. During today's webinar, I will be providing the information on the recycling regulations in Canada and the US. And I'm joined by my colleague, Jordan Gerling, who is a Senior Manager at Sphera EC4P and has been working with manufacturers for over 6 years to ensure that they are compliant with the WEEE batteries and packaging directives in Europe. Jordan will be explaining how the recycling regulations in the EU apply to North American companies who sell into Europe. So in today's webinar, we will be looking at some of the key challenges for manufacturers selling electronic products into the USA and Canada in order to comply to the e-waste, batteries and packaging legislation in place in these countries. We will also remind ourselves on how e-waste, batteries and packaging legislation is being implemented and enforced in the US and Canada, and what happens to companies who get it wrong and don't comply, with some examples of regulatory fines. We'll then take a look at how e-waste, batteries and packaging legislation extends to North American companies selling into Europe and how these companies can achieve compliance. And then we're going to demonstrate some of Sphera EC4P's compliance tools, which manufacturers can access to help them manage their compliance requirements to the changing e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations in the US and Canada. And this includes our interactive compliance risk map, which is an intuitive tool to see the current regulations in force for e-waste, batteries and packaging across the world, including US, Canada and Europe. And we also have our global regulatory monitoring services and how companies can use this to stay informed on changes to e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations across the world and understand how these changes will directly impact their business and recycling compliance obligations. So EC4P is now part of Sphera. Through software and consulting services, our experts work with organisations around the world to help them surface, manage and mitigate risk in areas of environment, health, safety and sustainability, operational risk management and product stewardship. Sphera's product stewardship solutions, of which EC4P is proudly part of, helps clients to create safer, more sustainable products and effectively manage chemicals throughout their life cycle up to end of life recycling. Specifically, our EC4P managed e-waste, batteries and packaging compliance services are provided by our team in the southwest of the UK and ensure companies meet their obligations for product registration, reporting and end-of-life take-back and recycling. And as you can see, we've been active in the area of product compliance since 2003. Okay, so let's briefly consider the main recycling compliance challenges for product manufacturers selling into these countries. Firstly, you must identify in which US states and Canadian provinces and territories there are e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations currently in force. And as you'll see shortly, this must be done at a state-by-state level in the US and at a provincial level in Canada. And what about new e-waste legislation being introduced or amended? There are continually new environmental policies, bills and regulations being put forward in the USA and Canada. In particular, packaging is a hot topic in North America at the moment. So for example, Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York and Washington, they're all looking to implement extended producer responsibility regulations for packaging at the moment. So we can likely expect to see some of the first EPR recycling schemes being introduced in the US within the next year or so, with companies being responsible for paying for packaging collection and recycling costs. And a number of packaging and single-use plastic bills have recently been proposed in California under the 2021 legislative plastic and waste reduction package. And in January of this year, Canada formed the Canada Plastics Pact and became the 9th country to become a member of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Plastics Pact Network. So once any applicable regulations have been identified, you then need to determine whether the types of products you sell are covered under these e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations, as the scope of the regulations will vary between each region. But you also need to consider your sales arrangements in each US state and Canadian province or territory. So for example, have you got a sales office in a particular state or province? Are your products sold only via retailers in a particular state or province? And what if your company is non-compliant? What are the risks for regulatory fines and penalties? And what do these fines look like in the US and Canada? Now in the US and Canada, where there are regulations in place, if your company is classed as a producer for e-waste, batteries or packaging, there are a number of compliance challenges which your company needs to tackle. So you'll need to register your company and your products with the appropriate regulatory authority in that particular state or province and pay a registration fee. And this can be many thousands of dollars per year. You may then need to submit a waste handling program to the regulator, which must detail how it will provide for collection and recycling. You will then almost certainly need to report equipment sales data in that particular state or province. And you will then have to pay for the collection, transport and recycling of the waste in accordance with the available arrangements in that state. Okay, so e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations in the US. As you may be aware, there is currently no e-waste legislation in place at a federal level in the US. The US has implemented the Mercury Containing and Rechargeable Battery Management Act at the federal level, but these do not place obligations on producers to pay for batteries collection and recycling. And in 2020, we saw a packaging EPR bill being proposed through the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And this bill has been proposed again this year as it failed to pass last year. And at a state level, things get a little bit more challenging. We've now got 25 US states which have implemented their own e-waste regulations, covering the collection and recycling of electronic products at end of life, many of which use an EPR model to pay for collection and recycling. 9 US states have implemented batteries recycling regulations, with 8 of these states involving some form of EPR. And as I previously mentioned, we now also have an increasing number of states with proposed packaging legislation that include EPR requirements for packaging collection and recycling. If we look at regulatory enforcement and the fines for companies that do not comply to the recycling regulations in the US states, well, by looking at some of these example state e-waste and batteries regulations, you can see that if your company is classed as a producer in a particular US state, there are some significant fines if you fail to comply. with up to a $25,000 fine for manufacturers in California. And just to give you some idea on the challenges of understanding which products fall in scope in those US states for e-waste regulations, covered electronic devices are decided upon by each individual US state, and therefore the scope of products covered in each US state is potentially different. States that have implemented e-waste legislation currently include a small scope, not going beyond TVs, computers, and often IT peripherals. But we are now seeing US states expanding their product scope to include many other types of equipment. Okay, so let's look at Canada now with its implementing e-waste batteries and packaging regulations. So there's currently no e-waste batteries or packaging legislation in place at a federal level in Canada. And like the US, we have e-waste batteries and packaging regulation laws implemented at a local level, with 12 provinces and territories having implemented their own e-waste regulations, 6 provinces and territories implementing batteries regulations, and 5 provinces and territories have implemented packaging regulations. The e-waste batteries and packaging recycling obligations for companies selling products in Canada are met in all provinces across a range of compliance methods, including EPR models where companies must join a local recycling scheme, through to providing individual collection and recycling arrangements, right through to joining state-run recycling programs. There are also rapidly evolving changes to the e-waste regulations in Canada. For example, in Ontario, we have a whole new electronics recycling regime. So from the 1st of January this year, individual producers became legally responsible for meeting province e-waste collection and recycling requirements, which is a departure from the state-run programme Ontario Electronic Stewardship, or OES, that was previously used. And we're anticipating that other Canadian provinces will move to this individual producer responsibility model in the future. Again, like the US, if we look at regulatory enforcement and fines for companies that do not comply to the recycling regulations in Canada, some of these are particularly eye-watering. Again, just looking at e-waste regulation fines for a few provinces, we see fines of up to 500,000 Canadian dollars in Alberta for selling in-scope equipment without participating in the recycling programme. Fines of up to 200,000 Canadian dollars in British Columbia for the same, and fines of up to 100,000 Canadian dollars per day in Ontario where the company is non-compliant. And again, just to give you an idea on the challenges of understanding which products fall in scope under provincial e-waste regulations, this is what it looks like on a province-by-province basis. So compared to the US, you can immediately see the scope of products covered by Canadian province and territory e-waste laws tend to be much wider. And the concept of consumer and professional use products is not defined in the provincial and territorial e-waste regulations. And therefore, many of the e-waste laws cover both consumer and professional use products equally. So Jordan will now take you through some of the WEEE batteries and packaging requirements producers face in Europe and how they will apply to companies selling from North America.
Like Lisa mentioned, this section of the webinar relates to European compliance requirements. European compliance requirements will, of course, affect companies with sales offices in Europe. But the requirements will also apply to a very large number of North American companies. Any North American companies that are selling products direct to customers in Europe will have obligations. The backbone of European regulations that were originally published a couple of decades ago did only place legal obligations on European-based companies. However, companies outside of Europe also place products directly on the European market. So in order to ensure that the collection and recycling of all waste arisings is financed before the products and packaging arise as waste, European regulations needed to place legal obligations on non-European based sellers. And this began about 10 years ago and has developed dramatically since then. In Europe, there are three overarching directives: the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, the WEEE Directive, the Batteries Directive, and the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. And as the directives are environmental directives, they need to be implemented at a country level. Thus, every EU member state, EFTA country, and the United Kingdom implements the directives into national legislation slightly differently. And this means that there are over 93 e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations for sellers to comply with in Europe, all of which have various deviations from the European level directives. And this level of complexity causes significant challenges for sellers. A North American company selling products directly to customers in Europe, for example, via a web store, will have obligations in 25 of the 27 EU member states for e-waste, 15 of the 27 EU member states for batteries, and 8 of the 27 EU member states for packaging. And these numbers are always increasing because it is becoming more apparent to member state regulators that if not all companies placing products on national markets have obligations to provide for recycling, then only a proportion of waste arisings are being provided for. Placing legal obligations on larger numbers of companies increases the amount of money paid by sellers, which can be used to treat the same amount of waste that's on the market. If a company sells into every European country, like I mentioned, they could have 93 different regulations to comply with. This means that for 93 different scenarios, companies need to understand the legislation, understand the process for registering with a national regulator, understand how they can implement collection and recycling compliance arrangements in a compliant way, understand how, when, and in what format they need to submit regulatory sales declarations, and of course, pay recycling and registration fees to all applicable vendors across Europe. Coordinating and managing this internally is extremely challenging for compliance managers. With EC4P, all aspects of compliance are consolidated and managed through a single platform. EC4P understand the legislation for you. We also complete the registrations and implement the legally robust and the most cost-effective compliance arrangements, complete all required sales declarations, and pay all registration and recycling costs on behalf of your company. This allows compliance across all of Europe to be managed with a single report and a single invoice. There are many different ways that foreign companies can comply with their obligations in Europe, some being more cost-effective than others. EC4P monitor fees for over 330 recycling schemes across Europe to ensure that clients have the most cost-effective compliance arrangements as possible. It's also worth noting that whilst there are over 330 recycling schemes in Europe to choose from, not all of them are suitable for all companies. If a foreign company registers with the wrong recycling scheme in a particular country, they may not technically be fulfilling all of their legal obligations because the registration with the regulators needs to be completed in a certain way for foreign companies. This is different to how a local sales office would comply with their obligations. The table that you're seeing on the screen now highlights the recycling schemes that are available in a select number of European countries, just to demonstrate how many different options there are for companies to comply with their obligations. In the United Kingdom, for example, there are around 50 different recycling schemes to choose from. In order to ensure that the compliance arrangements that are implemented are legally robust, as well as the most cost-effective, companies can either evaluate over 330 recycling schemes themselves, or work with Sphera EC4P to recommend the best recycling scheme, depending on how your company sell products and the types of products that your company sell. Back over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jordan. So let's return to this diagram of the compliance challenges manufacturers face with the rapidly changing regulations in the North America region. I'm going to put them in the context of some of Sphera EC4P's tools and offerings, which can help manufacturers along this journey to compliance in both North America and European regions, as well as other parts of the world where we're seeing these regulations pop up. So on this first slide, in which states and provinces are you likely to be obligated as a producer? What type of products are in scope and what are the penalties for non-compliance? Essentially, what is your company's risk exposure for non-compliance? This is where Sphera EC4P's freely available interactive compliance risk map can help. This is available at ec4p.com/legislation, and it currently covers North America and Europe. So please head there to get summaries and state by state or province by province overviews of e-waste, batteries and packaging regulations and laws in Canada and the US, which include tabulated comparisons of in which states regulations have been enacted, a state-by-state indicative product scopes, state-by-state fines and applicable enforcements for non-compliance, information on liable parties, registration options and reporting requirements. And you can also sign up with your email to be notified as we update the map information throughout 2021 for both North America and Europe. And you'll also be notified as well as we expand the map information to cover other global regions later in 2021. So the European content of the map includes a member state risk comparison and a per country risk profile with more detailed country profiles available for download. So the map can help manufacturers in the first part of the journey or path to compliance, particularly in new territories. If companies are already compliant in Europe, for example, then they may not be aware that they have compliance gaps in regions where legislation is expanding. And the first way to start to address this is to use a tool like the compliance comparison map. But this is just the first step. So if we return to the spider diagram, how can manufacturers better track new legislation as it becomes enacted, and how can they also track changes to existing legislation, specifically as it relates to their product range and sales arrangements in the regions they are selling their products? So this is where Sphera EC4P's regulatory monitoring service comes in. And here I've got a typical compliance timeline which companies should go through when assessing their compliance obligations and identifying where compliance arrangements are needed. So first off, you need to assess whether any legislation for e-waste, batteries or packaging has been implemented in the countries or states in which you're selling products. And of course, the more countries you're selling into, the more complex this assessment is going to be. And you might want to think about using something like our compliance map to help you with this first step. Secondly, In countries where there is legislation in place, you then need to assess whether your products are actually in scope. So do the regulations stipulate between consumer and professional use products? What are the e-waste categories? Are different types of batteries regulated differently? And if your products are in scope, you need to determine what your options are to actually implement compliance arrangements. So in some countries and states, there's quite a large variety of options, as Jordan's just mentioned, for Europe. So if you have to join a compliance scheme, which of the available schemes is the right one for your products and your sales arrangements? And which will actually be the most cost-effective option? When you've put in place an authority or scheme registration for your company, you then need to calculate your recycling fees based on the amount of obligated products you have sold in that country, either by weight or quantity of categorized products. And in addition, you might also need to implement and make available a waste or recycling program plan that's often required in many countries. Lastly, you'll then need to ensure that you stay on top of compliance data reporting, and you will need to track any changes to legislation and make the associated adjustments to ensure that you remain compliant. So there's quite a lot to do to make sure that you have a robust compliance program in place. Sphera EC4P can help companies through this process in two main ways. If the answer to any of the first three questions is no, EC4P can monitor the regulations for you and notify you of any applicable changes in legislation, which might then bring your activities or products into scope via our quarterly compliance update service. The second way we can help is to actually manage the compliance assessment and implementation process on your behalf. And that leads me nicely onto the third way that Sphera EC4P can help. So if the first two steps are concerned with identifying where there is legislation and determining if your company is obligated under that legislation, then the third step is really about the nitty-gritty of putting compliance arrangements in place, or a more comprehensive compliance program in place if you already have one. And this is where Sphera EC4P's managed or outsourced compliance services come in. To help with all aspects of putting a centralised compliance program in place, which can fully and formally assess manufacturers' obligations, provide cost-effective registration and reporting solutions, manage complex scheme processes, and even pay a company's registration and recycling fees, giving the benefit of putting all your compliance costs from many different schemes and regulatory entities under one supplier invoice from ourselves. So that's all of the benefits for our compliance team. And then we have our cloud platform, which gives you a full overview of all of your registrations and compliance obligations from one dashboard. You can manage all of your data reporting deadlines on the same dashboard. And we're now mapping reporting formats for well over 330 compliance schemes around the world. You get notified ahead of important deadlines, so nothing is missed. And you can even outsource the data processing part using our data wire and admin service, where you can push your ERP outputs to EC4P, and we do all the data processing for you. So I'll now pass you back to Jordan.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll leave the share with you, if that's okay.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, there's only a couple of slides just to not drag people through my sharing issue. Thank you. So yeah, there are two main flows of our European-based service offerings. One of them being, if your company have existing WEEE batteries or packaging compliance arrangements in place, which is quite possible, we can audit your arrangements to confirm that they are suitable and to identify any compliance gaps that you may have. We can then assist with upgrading any compliance arrangements where required. If your company do not have any existing WEEE batteries or packaging compliance arrangements in place, we can provide a compliance assessment which determines your company's legal exposure, exactly which countries you have legal obligations to do something in, and subsequently implement compliance arrangements for you. In practice, a project would utilize both service offerings somewhat because most companies have a mismatch of compliance arrangements from country to country across Europe. For any compliance arrangements that your company has in place, either implemented by EC4P or implemented by your company prior to the start of any project, they can all be consolidated to ec4p.com. Transferring all of your company's WEEE batteries and packaging compliance arrangements to ec4p.com for centralized management allows all declarations to be submitted and recorded in a single location. And ec4p also manages the ongoing registration arrangements, pays all recycling fees so that you only receive one invoice from one supplier, and keeps you up to date with regulation changes. Slide, please, Lisa. Thank you. To conclude on this presentation, ec4p can manage all e-waste batteries and packaging compliance challenges on your company's behalf anywhere in the world, including Europe and North America, of course, as is the basis of this webinar. New legislation and amendments to existing legislation are tracked on your company's behalf. Legal exposure and whether the legislative scope is applicable to your company is identified, as well as the identification of any applicable recycling fees and registration and reporting requirements and procedures. And there is, of course, more information about our various service offerings at our website, ec4p.com.